Okay, hi everyone. I think we'll just get started on this training. Um, so my name is Nikki Easterday. I'm an attorney with TILDEF, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, a new addition to TILDEF since October, but prior to that, I spent 6 years at CSS in the Chan Champ programs. So also, if you hear background noise, I live on a busy street. So I'll try my best to pause if like a truck goes by. So today I wanted to go over sort of current access to gender affirming care issues in New York. I'm going to sort of survey most of the forms of insurance. I do want to make a note that if any of the specialists on the call have some information about Medicare, Medicaid, etc., please jump in. And also, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat and I will answer them as they come in. But with that, I think we can just get started. And it's not letting me advance. Okay, there we go. So just by way of, a little bit of introduction, TILDEF has a trans health project. That's my primary focus, and we engage in public education, movement building, legal services, and policy advocacy. I want to note that our legal services are largely impact litigation. So whereas I can provide TA if you have questions, we typically don't assist in direct legal services, which is a shame in my opinion, but that is sort of where our org is at. Great. So here's the agenda. I'm going to open with just some general best practices for working with transgender non-binary clients. Some general considerations are just very broad things to keep in mind when working on these types of cases. And then I want to go through each of these insurance programs or types of insurance to kind of talk about the current issues. And I want to conclude with some upcoming changes to keep in mind. So for best practices, I'm just gonna quickly run through it. These are just general best practices for working with transgender non-binary or gender non-conforming clients. So first one, respect the terminology a TGNC person uses to describe their identity. If they identify as a trans woman or as trans feminine or non-binary, trans masculine, trans man, etc., that's the identity, that's the terminology, and you should always follow the lead of your client. Ask pronouns and state yours. Really important and very simple thing to do to express that that you respect someone's gender identity, and that you are competent around gender identity is to ask and use pronouns. It's great to state yours as an opener and then also ask your client what pronouns they use. There is a tendency to only do that if you can't tell. I strongly encourage you to just make that a general practice, just sort of in all kind of in first contacts with clients. Both, I think it helps in sort of like exercising that muscle of just making this something that you feel comfortable doing and that you do consistently. And also it's tremendously important for your clients. And yeah, use the correct pronoun and name even when the client is not present. That's also crucial. And it both shows just a basic level of respect for your client, but it also helps you use the right pronouns and the right name when you are talking to the client. Similarly, if someone else is making a mistake around the pronouns or the name of the client, correct them. If someone, including the client, corrects you, say thank you, correct yourself, and move on. We used to sort of advise, say, like a briefly apologize, but in general, if you don't want to get into the situation where you're overly apologizing for making a mistake and then are now forcing the client to essentially say like, oh no, it's fine, when it may not be fine, right? And it also shifts the focus onto your feelings as opposed to your client's feelings. So if you're corrected, say thank you, correct yourself, continue. This next one I think is really important, educate yourself. So the resources are actually not at the end of the presentation, they're at the next slide. There are a number of resources that will, I think, are quite helpful in breaking down the various different terms, in providing an understanding of how and when to use those terms and why it's important. I'm not going through them today. The next slide will have those lists. Those lists are also designed for people who are not part of the trans and non-binary community to understand the importance of pronouns and terms, and also kind of the panoply of terms that you might encounter. It's very, very important. If you are working with a trans or non-binary person, I think it's a great, I think it's absolutely worth it to spend some time just reviewing, basic terminology so that you can assist your client competently and in an appropriate manner. The offering to escort your client to the bathroom of their choice, less of an issue now that for a lot of us are remote. The reason we're highlighting this here is that there is, the use of bathrooms can be very fraught for trans folks, non-binary folks. In fact, trans and non-binary people avoid using bathrooms so much that they actually can often develop bladder issues, because bathrooms can be a heavily policed space, both like actually in terms of police, but largely just using the term and meaning that there are a lot of feelings that people have about who should use which bathroom. So offering to escort your client to the bathroom of their choice is a great way of communicating that you respect their gender identity, and that you are going to support them in this choice of bathroom. You should also avoid using gendered language like sir and ma'am. This is particularly huge on the phone, where you have like no contextual clues, and it's often sort of just assumed to be polite, but using gendered language like sir and ma'am pretty much puts you in a situation where you might be unintentionally misgendering someone. And I think it's best to sort of excise that from your general language when you're doing client-facing work. Okay, now this is the problem where I'm kind of in the frame. Don't ask a transgender or non-binary person what their real name is. For enrollment or other situations, if you need to know what their legal name is, ask them, like, what is the name on the legal document? The use of the term real is problematic. It also indicates that, or it can be received as, I don't respect what name you use, I only respect the name that's on your legal documents, and that is quite off-putting, I think, is like a light way of putting it, but it communicates to the client that you do not respect their gender identity, and it erodes trust. And then the last one, which I wish I wasn't blocking, don't assume you know someone's gender identity or sexuality simply on how they look. That is something that broadly in society we're conditioned to do. It's something that you should actively work against. Okay, these resources, they're good, they're user-friendly, they're designed to communicate to a non-trans or non-binary audience. So, I'm not going to say, oh, go Google it, use one of these resources. They are like trans approved, right? Like if you use the terms and the resources from these 3 sites, you will be well positioned to work with trans and non-binary clients. Okay, so turning to more substance, gender affirming care, which I'm going to refer to as GAC or GAC throughout the rest of this training, is routinely denied irrespective of insurance type or governing regulations. This is largely true for like most New York people who are accessing gender affirming care. Despite New York having a bunch of really great protections, gender affirming care is going to be routinely denied, more so than a wide range of other medical care or diagnoses. So when working with clients, I always one of the first things I talk through with clients is this: you're going to have to fight this. When I do community trainings, I talk about you are absolutely have to come in and with the perspective that you're going to have to fight this. And as advocates, I think it's important to let your clients know, regardless of, more or less regardless of the laws on the books, they should expect and plan to go through the appeal process, a fair hearing, filing complaints, etc. And I think taking that mindset that this is, this is not a simple fix. This has to be fought, will set you up to kind of always be prepared for what is 99% of the time what's going to be necessary. You should be familiar with the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, WPATH, standard of care. This is the primary medical text that you want to be using in appeals and advocacy. It's also the standard of care. There's also standard of care issued by the Endocrine Society, and this is particularly important if you're working with minors who are seeking puberty blockers or hormone replacement therapy. The more something a plan's clinical criteria or etc. aligns with the WPATH, the more likely you are to be able to get that service covered, but also, or maybe let me reverse that. The more something deviates from WPATH, the more likely you are seeing a policy or a decision that is not based in medical science and should be appealed, and also complaints should be filed. And then the last general consideration, which is touching on something I just mentioned, cultural competency or humility is crucial for the client-advocate relationship and successful resolution of the case. I think we all understand the importance of having clients trust us and for us to be good advocates. For trans and non-binary folks, there is, I think it's pretty well evident, a huge amount of discrimination and transphobic discrimination in general. That means when you're working with trans and non-binary clients, you need to earn that trust, and that trust comes from demonstrating cultural competency or humility. So using the correct pronouns, understanding the terminology, showing an ability to apologize, or not apologize, but to thank being corrected and move forward. All of those things are really crucial in maintaining that relationship and that trust, which you will need to resolve the case. Okay, there's no questions there. I'm gonna just jump into commercial insurance. So as a brief overview for commercial insurance, looking at fully insured plans, this includes all NISO plans and small group plans in New York. The Department of Financial Services, DFS, prohibits categorical exclusions of gender-affirming care in the plan policy documents. So if you're looking at the actual plan policy, it can't say something like, we don't cover ND gender-affirming care. It'll also, if it is there, you'll likely see, we don't cover sex transformation surgery. They're typically going to use an outdated term. You're unlikely to see that in fully insured plans in New York, since it's been since 2014, this categorical, or this prohibition of an exclusion has been in effect. So in 2020, OMH, the Office of Mental Health, will now be reviewing the clinical criteria for gender affirming care for plans that are subject to New York law. This is really great because prior to this, the clinical criteria was not being reviewed. Just as a quick primer, clinical criteria is the internal health insurance document that they use during utilization review to determine whether or not something's covered. And they're maintained for a large number of procedures and or diagnosis. And also most of these for most insurers is online. So OMH has said that there cannot be a categorical exclusion in the clinical criteria that excludes a procedure as cosmetic. Something that we've seen for a long time in New York is they will take certain procedures like facial feminization surgery or facial gender confirmation surgery and say, under all circumstances, it's cosmetic, we'll never cover it. But they'll put that in the clinical criteria. You'll also see that for body contour, like masculinizing body contouring, voice surgery, voice therapy. So OMH is reviewing that. I think part of that as advocates is that if you are seeing clinical criteria that has categorical exclusions or is designating something as cosmetic always, these are things that a complaint should be filed and should be reported. Just sort of as a reminder, even with all of these great regulations and rules put out by New York State, gender affirming care is still going to be routinely denied by fully insured plans. So these rules are good, but in reality, to access gender affirming care, particularly something like facial feminization surgery, the appeal process is going to be required. And you're not likely to succeed on internal appeal as usual. These are cases that will almost always need to go to external appeal. If you can shepherd it to external appeal, your chances of winning are pretty good. I took a quick review of the DFS external appeal database before this training, and denials of gender affirming care are overturned at about a 2-to-1 rate. So that's getting to external appeal for a fully insured plan is sort of your best avenue or venue to get the care covered. If you see categorical exclusions in the plan policy or the clinical criteria, absolutely file complaints to the relevant agencies. I spoke with a number of folks at these agencies somewhat recently. They don't see something unless it comes in as a complaint. And I think it's important to remember, DFS, OMH, and the AG, if they're not getting complaints, they don't know that it's an issue. I know this is something that we repeat all the time. I know when I was at CHA, I was always like, oh yeah, we need to file more complaints. We need to file more complaints. This is just once again, a reminder that that's hugely important. Cool. If there's no questions on commercial fully insured, we're going to move to self. Again, any questions, throw them in the chat. Happy to just talk about them as we go through this. Questions or comments? All right, so self-insured. Commercial insurance, self-insured in New York is for, and if you'll excuse me, it's a bummer. It's, these plans are not subject to New York insurance laws and regulations. They're likely to contain a full or partial exclusion of gender affirming care in the plan policy. And external appeal is unlikely to succeed if the categorical exclusion is in the plan document. Largely what I'm saying, for a number of these cases, legal representation is likely necessary. It's not always. I think CHA, and I think while I was at CHA, we've had some success on self-insured plans covering gender affirming care, but you're less likely to succeed on external appeal because instead of being handled through DFS, it's through an IRO that's hired by the health plan. And overall, we see that those are, just generally less likely to succeed. If there's a categorical exclusion in the plan document, they may not even get external appeal rights. Some things where that might be changing is after the Supreme Court decision in Bostock v. Clayton, which held that gender identity is a protected class, sort of underneath or like within the protected class of sex. Likely employers are going to be making moves to remove categorical exclusions in their plans if they operate in New York, where there's a chance where essentially they're more vulnerable to being pursued. Also, if the employer is in New York City, they may also be vulnerable to a complaint to the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Again, legal representation is likely needed for that. It's not required, but it is helpful. So there are certain avenues you can take for a self-insured commercial policy, but recognize that it is one of the most difficult situations in which to access care because so many of the protections and processes that we rely on aren't available. Just as a heads up, there are two New York educational institutions, NYU and Columbia Law School, both maintain categorical exclusions and both are in New York City. And so both are pretty vulnerable, both under Bostock and under the standards put out by the New York City Commission of Human Rights, as well as New York State human right law. They're both vulnerable. So if anyone wants to jump on those, that's great. Also let me know, because I'm also interested in pursuing them. Okay, Medicare. Definitely want to once again say, if there's any specialists on the call want to jump in, correct me, offer new information, etc., please do. I'm not a Medicare expert by any means. So the landscape for Medicare is difficult. There is no national coverage determination, an NCD. Medicare removed the NCD that said we never cover gender affirming care, but then declined to issue an NCD that does say they cover gender affirming care, and have left it to be determined on a case-by-case basis by the regional office. Local coverage determinations or local coverage articles, these are used by the MACs, which is what, Medicare something coordinator. I'm sorry, I can't remember what that acronym stands for. But a lot of coverage decisions around access to gender affirming care are going to rely, they look to an NCD if there's no NCD, or they also look to an LCD or LCA. There's only one LCD, LCA. Thank you, Medicare Administrative Contractors. Thank you, Gio. There's only one of these that's been published anywhere at all. It's by a MAC, that Palmetto GBA. It is not good. It categorically excludes facial gender confirmation surgery and a wide range of procedures that trans folks need. I'm actually going to take a quick step just to talk about procedures really quickly. If there's no categorical exclusions, most trans folks can access hormones and surgery, bottom surgery, essentially genital surgery, largely without issue. The thing is that most trans people who are seeking surgery, genital surgery is not the first or the only form of surgery that they need. Typically, and we're seeing this a lot, facial gender confirmation surgery is of profound importance, particularly for trans feminine or trans women, because that is how we read gender. It's how we present to the world. Largely, most people don't see each other's genitals, right? That's not something that's very common, but the face is how we interact with the world. So exclusions of things that allow trans people to safely integrate into the community are of much higher need than genital surgery. And that coverage kind of across all the programs for the most part is sort of the inverse is flipped. Genital surgery is almost always covered, but procedures that folks need is to integrate into the community and to move safely through the world. Those are the ones that are almost routinely denied or categorically excluded. Returning to this LCA, something that I've seen recently is that other MACs are applying this LCA to their jurisdiction or service area. This LCA by Palmetto covers the Midwest largely, but we've seen MACs try to apply them in different jurisdictions, and it's entirely possible they might try to apply them in Medicare plans that are operating in New York. That needs to be challenged in an appeal. It's legally they're not allowed to do that, and it doesn't apply. But we're seeing those initial determinations being made where those using this LCA. There is also the lack of prior authorization with Medicare tends to be a huge problem because trans and non-binary folks on Medicare are put to a position of either, because they can't get prior authorization, they either need to pay the surgeon out of pocket and then try to get reimbursed, which is quite difficult. And also these surgeries can be $150,000 depending on what is being sought, which is a lot of, a pretty huge amount of money to put up. And so they pay out of pocket, then hope that they win on appeal post-service and can acquire reimbursement. For certain benefits, and I would defer to Geo, and other Medicare experts, certain categories of benefits, you can get a predetermination notice from Medicare. It's not available for all procedures, but can be a way of working around the lack of prior authorization. But the lack of prior authorization generally puts trans folks into either kind of an untenable situation or really vulnerable situation, and complicates the timing of care and also of the appeal process. And just general issues, there's limited in-network providers. And again, like with all of these things, clients should expect to appeal in order to access care. So there is some coverage under Medicare. It is difficult. Your client will need to fight it, and the Medicare appeal process itself is also quite lengthy and more involved than commercial insurance or Medicaid. So it's there, but it's not easy, I guess, is like the broad takeaway. Okay, now moving to Medicaid. So Medicaid is currently the gold standard for access to gender affirming care in New York. It is by no means perfect. I want to be clear, but compared to most other policies or forms of insurance, it is ideal. Not ideal, it's the gold standard. So most procedures are covered, including facial gender confirmation surgery, including access to care for minors. The Medicaid regulations are very detailed and specific about what needs to be covered, and is more robust than most commercial packages. And the regulations specifically say that provider determinations of medical necessity need to be given priority in the utilization review, which is phenomenal. And there's less ability for plans to use discriminatory clinical criteria, although they still do. All that being said, sort of the common theme of this whole training is that denials still occur regularly. And I would prioritize external appeal if possible. I think that's open to debate by Medicaid advocates. I think that if your clients are coming in for something like body contouring, which is not as explicitly supported by the Medicaid regs, you might want to go to external appeal, where you're working with medical reviewers, like medical professionals. I think if it's something that's clearly covered in the regs, fair hearing might be the way to go. But for cases where the regs are not as strong, personally, I would want to bring this in front of an external appeal, knowing that you can do both, but oftentimes it comes down to a question of which one you want to pursue. Yeah, and also I think most of the providers in New York, particularly in New York City, do accept some form of Medicaid, which is quite helpful and very different from pretty much everywhere else in the country. So the essential plan, for our purposes, it's identical to a QHP. It's just heavily subsidized. I wanted to say that it's important to make the distinction between Medicaid and the essential plan if you're talking about potential benefits to clients. So a lot of transgender folks and non-binary folks either are or have friends who are on Medicaid, and they're seeing how robust that coverage is and how much easier it is to get covered than under other types of insurance, and may expect that same ease of access if they're on the essential plan. But because the essential plan functions much more like a QHP in this regards, there's a expectation gap that you want to manage, which is that this is not Medicaid. This is the essential plan. That being said, there seems to be an inconsistent application of whether plans are using their commercial clinical criteria or their medical clinical criteria. So I believe UHC uses their community plan clinical criteria for essential plans, which is better because it's based on the New York Medicaid regs. But I just wanted to flag the essential plan because I think we all can note that like a lot of consumers aren't necessarily aware of the distinction between the two. And in this context, it's actually really important for consumers to understand the distinction. CHIP. So a growing trend is minors are seeking access to gender affirming care at like an increasing rate. Hormones and puberty blockers are generally accessible under CHIP, but surgical interventions are routinely / automatically denied. Some work that I did on this prior to coming to TILDEF revealed that, or at least what I was hearing from CHIP and from New York State regulators, is that CHIP does not have a blanket exclusion, or should not have a blanket exclusion in the plan policy, because CHIP is also subject to the DFS guidance that it can't have this exclusion. The core issue here is that CHIP uses the issuer's commercial clinical criteria. Sorry, that's a tricky tongue twister, which almost always limits surgery to 18 plus or age of majority. So what I've seen, and what presumably we will continue to see, what we've seen is someone will be on CHIP, a kid will be on CHIP trying to access gender affirming surgery, most likely, but we'll be getting denial saying this is not covered until you're 18 plus. Hopefully with some advocacy with OMH to make sure that commercial insurance is not excluding care for minors, that will resolve this issue. But like that's where most of the denials are occurring from, and it's something to be aware of. I'll also say that masculinizing chest surgery for minors is well supported in the WPATH standard of care. So if you can get this to an appeal, particularly an external appeal, you have a good chance of succeeding, because the WPATH standards of care themselves are like masculinizing chest surgery, which is essentially a mastectomy with some reconstruction, is appropriate for folks who are under 18 if they meet a few criteria, namely hormones. They've been on hormones for a certain amount of time. So if you can get it to external appeal, you have a good chance of winning. But just want to note that's where these denials are largely originating from, is the use of commercial clinical criteria for CHIP plans. Great, so just moving to upcoming changes. So HHS just issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, and the sort of key big takeaway, everywhere in the ACA non-discrimination provisions, which is quite vast, when they were first issued, they included gender identity and sexual orientation as a protected class that you can't discriminate against. The Trump administration went back and directed HHS to go back and just scrape every reference to gender identity and sexual orientation out of those regs. So the big change is that HHS is putting them all back in, which is phenomenal. It's not going to have a huge effect in New York because our state laws are pretty are good and sort of ahead of the curve on this. But it will help sort of change the landscape, and it is something to be aware of. It's also likely going to make gender affirming care a mandated under the essential health benefits. Section 1557 has a really long and storied history. It sort of takes a bunch of federal non-discrimination provisions, says all of those apply to insurers that receive federal funding for any of their programs. Right before it's supposed to go into effect, it also establishes a private right of action and also the right to bring complaints through the Office of Civil Rights with HHS, which can be a powerful tool if you have a plan that's subject to the ACA but not subject to state law. Right before it's supposed to go into effect, a judge in Texas issued a nationwide injunction barring it from going into an effect. Then during the Trump, right before the Trump administration started, then the Trump administration issued a rule that was a similar rollback. That was the subject of a lawsuit and a nationwide injunction. And then HHS somewhat recently said they're now working on a new proposed rule for Section 1557. So in a very legally, terminology, it's a hot mess. And it's kind of unclear where it's going to end up. But it can be a powerful tool depending on how that all shakes out. And sort of the most important thing is that WPATH standards of care are issuing a new version. It'll be WPATH SOC version 8, which is very welcome news since the last version was published in 2011. Part of why this is incredibly important is the amount of research, medical literature that supports gender affirming care has exponentially grown since 2011 to now. And so the hope was that the new edition of the WPATH standards of care will take into account and incorporate all of this new medical literature. I've seen some of the proposed changes. It's better. It's not, I think, what advocates were hoping for. But it's important to note that that's going to be issued sometime this year. And that's going to be the standard to be using when you're arguing or advocating for your clients. Yeah, also, so that's sort of the end. I'll just do that quick little plug, the Trans Health Project, which we have a website, and we do have a number of resources, including medical literature reviews, clinical criteria for most issuers. We also have client-facing stuff, like how does the health insurance work for trans folks, and what do you need to keep in mind when you're navigating it? That can be a good resource for clients. And we also have an intake form there as well. So that's all I have to say. Also, that's my email if you want TA. I'm happy to answer any questions about this or in general. Yeah, are there any? Thank you everyone saying this has been great. I really appreciate that. Are there any questions or anything that y'all want to talk about? I've tried to move pretty fast, so we have a lot of time.
We do have a lot of time. Thank you so much, Nikki.
Of course.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Hi, this is Diane again. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment about one of the pieces of advice that you gave, Nikki, regarding, getting your client to external appeal, because it's often they're in a much better place to go in front of a panel of doctors or a doctor to have their case reviewed rather than an internal plan representative or even an ALJ. Just a plug for that is helping the consumer through an internal appeal. And often on our helpline, we have consumers file, we give DIY materials. We tell folks even to file verbally and then follow up with a letter, because for these types, for lots of different types of appeal, but overwhelmingly for these types of appeals, it doesn't matter what you send to the plan. Sending them, a note that says I appeal is fine, and it will get them to where they need to be in terms of their final adverse determination, so that sparks the right to external. And you don't need to make a record internally. And often, even if you do, it's kind of you may need to prep the case anyway, but it's wasted time doing so internally often for these cases. So really, to get folks in front of a medical professional is the best scenario. And of course, we do these kinds of appeals all the time. We have one going out next week on facial feminization surgery. And we are, thanks to Nikki, very, very kind of seasoned in this practice. So happy to take referrals for these clients at any point in their kind of procedure around access to care and at any point in their appeals process. We also have a resource that Nikki worked really hard on that we're trying to get finalized and we'll send around. It's a bit in the weeds for folks who really do this all the time. So depending upon your the consumers you serve, some of it might be a little bit in the weeds, but we're going to send it around and have it posted on the portal. And it's very useful in terms of just setting the groundwork for what kind of rights folks have depending upon their insurance and what the appeal processes are. And it gives some templates, which are really very helpful.
Awesome. I also want to say it's co-sign everything that you just said, Diane. That's absolutely true, right? The internal appeals process, it is nothing more than an administrative burden or a hoop to get through. Nothing that is submitted will change their mind. It's also really crucial to explain that to the clients, right? Because it's incredible. So one of the things I would say the difference between gender affirming care and say something like knee surgery is that knee surgery, for the most part, is not going to involve a core component of your identity. So these denials of care for trans and non-binary folks are devastating, personally devastating, because they are being denied access to care that will help them align their body with their own internal sense of identity. And repeatedly being denied on the internal appeals is quite difficult. And you can really sort of sidestep that by saying they're never going to say yes, and it doesn't matter because we're going to external appeal, right? Like that's where this matters. So I think it's really crucial to communicate to clients like, don't take to heart the no's that you're getting from the plan. They're always going to say no. Yeah.
Right, but that you also must file that internal appeal,
yes,
however useless, in order to spark your right to an independent review.
Absolutely. Like, don't worry about the no's, but like the only thing that matters is getting it in on time. I continue to say the advice. I think, Diane, to be honest, I think I said almost verbatim what you said recently to a client where I was like, even if you write on scrap of paper, I appeal this decision, as long as you get it in before the deadline, that's the most important thing.
Right. So a lot of folks on this call might be helping with those initial steps and then referring, and that is perfect.
Great.
I have a question. I am working with a client that was referred to us through ACR Health, through our youth program, and transportation out of St. Lawrence County for services, even though they have the gold standard Medicaid, is a challenge. And I really appreciate this training because learning to advocate for people effectively is important. This youth knows how to advocate, but I'm learning a lot of, like, they told me that their dead name is still on all their insurance cards and they're in the process of moving through everything. So these are the kind of struggles up in the North Country that we're working with, and I'm learning so much. Thank you. This has been a great training.
Awesome. I appreciate that. Also, if they need, TILDEF also has the name change program. So if they need legal assistance with the name, like if that's a service they could use, they should absolutely, either you or they should reach out to the name change program at TILDEF.
Yeah, they're already in the process of that, I'm sure.
Phenomenal. Great. Just wanted a quick little plug, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm also glad that you raised medical transportation. My understanding is it's just kind of bleak across the board. Like no one's getting really good access to medical transportation. It is incredibly important around gender affirming care because there's so few providers. Most people, if they're not living in New York City or the 5 boroughs, need a form of transportation. There's very few providers outside of New York City. So yeah, but thank you.
I think this is Diane again. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a great issue. We've done a couple of hearings against medical answering service, I believe, for folks who need out-of-county non-emergency transportation covered by Medicaid, and they're using the transportation vendor. I think, I don't want to misspeak here, but I think it's carved out of the Medicaid managed care benefit package throughout the state, and that different parts of the state use different vendors, and it's medical answering service for some of the state. But in any case, there's a specific regulation and a specific standard in the law for eligibility for out-of-county non-emergency transportation paid for by Medicaid. And so if you're having trouble, I believe I've supervised 2 or 3 hearings now on this issue. So I'm happy to give some TA or some guidance on getting this consumer or any consumer out of county or out of service area. I'm sorry, it's very specific language they use. Out of service area non-emergency transportation in order to receive gender affirming care. It seems like this would be this would exactly meet the standard in the law for access to, someone who needs access to care out of the service area if that care is not provided in the service area, and due to the unique consumer needs, they need to seek this care elsewhere. So let me know if you need help with that.
Great. I've been working directly with Fidelis.
Okay, and they're the vendor, so it's carved in
Yes.
to their benefit.
Yes. Yep.
Okay, yeah, let me know how you do. Fidelis is Fidelis.
Thank you.
Hi, Nikki. I think we've worked together before, but I just wanted to, first I wanted to say thank you for this presentation. I think it's really good, especially as a non-binary person. But I do have a question. I recently, very, very recently, I know I posted that our agency, Neighborhood Legal Services, does name changes. So one of our departments does that, which is really great. Recently, I got a client who called in with their dead name, and then just like most of these legal agencies, we have a system where we can kind of look up, their date of birth, their social security number, and their names pop up. Something that Legal Server has done is now put like preferred name inside of there, which is really helpful. But what I noticed when I looked up this client specifically, I looked up their date of birth. And so I had a few different names that came up because they actually went to our agency for a name change. When I spoke to them to do a CHA intake, they gave me their information, and it just happened to be their dead name. Not that this would, I guess, legally change anything, honestly, because it's just short-term services. But I guess my assumption is to call them they, them. Obviously, that's my assumption when I'm talking to most of my clients, and not address them by their, by sir or madam, since that's a huge pet peeve of mine, because that happens to me a lot. I get called ma'am pretty frequently. I'm kind of wondering, with your experience, what would be the best way of going about this in a way that I want to respect the client, because I know that terrible feeling of feeling like, oh, well, this is a medical thing, so I have to give them my dead name. But like knowing that they did you know what I'm saying? So I don't want to cross any confidentiality lines or anything like that, but I also want the client to be as comfortable as possible. So kind of just gone with it. I don't know if you have any advice on that. I know it's like weirdly specific, but I, as a person who has gone through that, and it is just a painful thing to do, I guess, I don't know what your advice would be on that, like moving forward with a case like that.
Yeah, so let me clarify what I think. So when they interacted with you, they never indicated like, I'm trans or non-binary or anything. So you only know of that because they've also connected through the name change program.
Correct.
And did they change their name?
Yes, they did. Like their name was legally changed and everything, but they still gave me their dead name. So that's where I was a little bit confused. Um, but also, wanted to respect them in the way that I didn't want to like call them out, you know what I mean? And say, oh, well, I know you did this thing here. Because that's pretty, I wouldn't
Yeah,
want
it
to
feels invasive, like that
absolutely, yeah.
they're
I
being
wouldn't want,
surveilled in a way. Yeah. I
right.
mean, honestly, like what I would do in this situation, and which I think in general, right, is like it's totally fine to be like, oh, hey, in this specific situation, because it's not your first point of contact, and you've presumably been having communications, it's like, oh, hey, I meant to do this when we first met. I forgot. Is there a name that you use day to day that differs from the name that you entered in the system? Is there a name that you would like for me to address you? Also, these are my pronouns. What are your pronouns, or how would you like me to address you? And you can frame it as like, I meant to ask this when we first connected. It's part of our standard procedure of like talking to folks, not like, I know that you changed your name, right? Which is agreed, terrible. So just frame it as like, this is our standard practice. I forgot to do it. I want to make up for that. I'm looping back, in the intake and thinking about the problem. I forgot to do the step, and then if they were like, cool, no, my dead name, then that's what you use.
That's what
right?
they want.
Like,
Yeah.
It's always deferring to the client, right? And ask, provide an open opportunity for them to say what their pronouns are and their name, and then go from there. I mean, like when I move through the world, I don't always I will sometimes use my dead name, right? Like, like when I go to the dentist, my dentist doesn't really need to know like my gender identity, etc. Right? So like, I also go to a dentist in a relatively conservative neighborhood. Like I'm just, for me, I'm not interested. Or I don't feel like that's a safe place for me to, I'm just like, I'm going to avoid that hot mess, and so they call me by the name on my insurance card. They use he, him pronouns for me. I realized I should have said I use they, them pronouns. That's how I've chosen to interact with that space. And I don't think you should be insulted if someone chooses to interact with you in that way, right? Like everyone trans and non-binary folks are making this calculation, and they're figuring out how they feel safest and how they want to navigate, which is why, it's always just ask and then do as they ask. And that's always going to be your safest bet. And I think in your situation, I would just use the like, I meant to, this is part of our intake form, right? Like there's like a preferred name thing. Although I don't like the use of preferred because it seems to, there's an indication that it's not your real name.
Yeah. That's just that's what it says in Legal Server too, which is interesting. Yeah,
for sure. I mean, it's a somewhat dated concept, but like I would just but I would just loop back and be like, oh, hey, I was reviewing your record. I realized that, we didn't have this conversation that I like to have with all my clients, and that is kind of part of our process. I would just lead with that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think it was also just a good thing to, talk about, because I think just addressing people in general can be really difficult. And I think sometimes people have a hard time with that. So I just felt like it was something that we could address. But thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
This is Diane again. I just want to make a plug. I asked Nikki to add a slide or two on cultural competence when case handling, and I want to make a plug for a training that Nikki gave a few years ago on cultural competence and case handling. It's part of our onboarding process for new CHA advocates, and it's up on the portal, and it's a great resource. An entire hour devoted to cultural competence around trans consumers, and also the handling of gender affirming care cases. So I'd love to, reference back to that and have people take a look at it if they have not already. And we can also send that around by way of follow-up to this meeting, because that was a really great training. That the full hour was devoted to cultural competence.
Awesome. Thanks, Diane, for both, the compliment and for that plug. Yeah, I think, it needs at least an hour. I think it's cultural competency is incredibly important broadly. It's absolutely important in this realm for this population and for this type of work. Yeah.
Thanks so much. We miss you, Nikki.
Thanks. I miss y'all too. Oh, I also want to say something that I learned having gone to TILDEF. The work y'all do is incredibly, incredibly important. I met with a bunch of LGBT impact litigators a couple months ago, and I just wanted to say that the #1 thing that kept coming up from all of these impact litigators from ACLU, yada, 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 across the country was how crucial direct legal services are in terms of actually getting access to care for trans and non-binary folk. There's some cool splashy wins of like removing exclusions, et cetera, for impact litigation, but across the board, the general consensus was that in terms of actually getting trans folks access to care, that is, it's direct legal services and advocacy organizations, like community-based organizations, like y'all are so important, and I don't think celebrated enough. And I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you all so much for the work you do, because it is of profound, profound importance. Yeah.
Thank you, Nikki. And thank you all. I definitely echo that. But I didn't just learn that from TILDEF. I knew that.
Great. This was great. I really appreciate you being here, Nikki. And as everyone said in the chat, they enjoyed your training. So thank you. Also, thank you to everyone that participated today. That was great. I'm so glad to see that everyone was enjoying the training. And with that, I think we can end a little bit early today. Thank you, everyone. I will follow up. I still owe you guys the December follow-up, and I will also send the January follow-up with that. Nikki, is it okay if I include your email in the follow-up email?
Yeah, please do. I'm available, to the extent that I can, I will answer TA questions. I'm, more than more than happy to.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming back, Nikki. We appreciate your time.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have
Thanks for
a
having me
great
back.
day.
Okay. Bye, y'all.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.